The rain fell like tiny needles from the dark alien sky, turning the streets into a mirror of glowing neon lights. Shadows moved in every corner. Faces hidden under hoods, eyes watching but never caring. In the middle of the street, under the flickering light of a broken sign, a young alien woman sat on the wet ground. Her thin arms wrapped around her knees. Her body shook as she cried quietly, her face hidden, the rain mixing with her tears until no one could tell the difference. Crowds passed by without looking, stepping around her as if she was nothing more than trash lying on the road. Some looked at her for a moment, but then quickly turned away. Afraid to get involved, this was the lower district of Virel City, a place where weakness was a death sentence. No one here stopped for strangers, not unless they wanted trouble. Jack, a human traveler, walked with his collar up, trying to stay dry. He had come here for work, just a delivery job, and planned to leave the same day. But when he saw her, small and fragile in the rain, something made him slow down. Her shoulders trembled with each sob, and though her species was not human, the sound of pain was the same in every language. Jack looked around, wondering if someone she knew would come to help. No one did. The people here had eyes like cold glass, always watching for danger, but never for kindness. Jack sighed and stepped closer. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling down so his face was level with hers. Her head lifted slowly, and he saw a pale face marked with faint bruises, her large, dark eyes wide and wet. For a moment, she stared at him like she could not believe someone had actually spoken to her. "What happened?" Jack asked, his voice calm but steady. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out broken. "They took everything," she whispered, her words shaking. Her gaze darted to the end of the street, where a group of shadowy figures stood half-hidden in the rain, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Jack followed her look and saw them tall, broad, and wearing the mark of the local gang. They were watching, waiting the moment Jack's eyes met theirs. One of them smiled in a slow, cruel way. Jack's instincts told him to walk away, to pretend he had not seen anything, but the fear in the girl's eyes stopped him. "Can you stand?" he asked, reaching out a hand. She hesitated, then took it with shaking fingers. When she stood, Jack realized she was lighter than he expected, as if she had not eaten in days. Her clothes were soaked and torn, her feet bare and red from the cold street. Jack put his jacket around her shoulders without thinking. She flinched at the sudden warmth but didn't let go of his hand. The gang members began walking toward them, their boots splashing in the puddles. Jack tightened his grip on her hand. "Come on," he said quietly, and led her away from the street. They walked fast, turning into a narrow alley that smelled of oil and rain. The sound of footsteps followed them, slow but steady. The girl's breathing quickened, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the rain. Jack didn't answer, but he guided her through the maze of backstreets until they reached a small diner with a flickering blue light over the door. The smell of warm food drifted out when he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the quiet hum of old machinery. They sat in the corner booth, far from the window. Jack ordered 2 hot drinks and waited until the girl's shaking began to slow. "Name?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then said, "Lyra." Her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. "I'm Jack," he replied. "You're safe here, for now." But even as he said the words, he knew it wasn't true. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement outside the diner, the same shadowy figures. Standing in the rain, they didn't come in, but their presence was a warning. They were letting him know this wasn't over. Lyra noticed them too, and her hands gripped the edge of the table tightly. "They won't stop," she said, her voice trembling. "They never stop." Jack leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He didn't know why he had stepped in, why he hadn't just walked away, but now, sitting here with her. He understood once you saw someone drowning, you couldn't pretend the water wasn't there. The rain outside grew heavier, and the shadows in the street seemed to thicken. Somewhere deep inside, Jack knew that helping her was going to cost him more than he had ever imagined. And yet, he also knew he wasn't going to walk away. Not now, not ever. The rain had slowed. The streets still glistened with a cold shine. The kind that made the city feel alive and dangerous at the same time. Jack walked beside Lyra, keeping his pace steady so she wouldn't feel rushed. She still wore his jacket, the sleeves far too long for her arms, and every so often she glanced behind them as if expecting a shadow to follow. He didn't need to look to know someone was probably there. The diner had been a temporary shield, but it was clear the gang's eyes were still on them. Jack had seen the way one of the men outside had touched the side of his neck, a silent signal that meant you're marked. It wasn't a threat you could ignore. It was a warning that your life had just changed. Lyra walked with her head down, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. She moved like someone who had spent years making herself invisible. Someone who had learned that if you didn't look up, maybe the predators wouldn't notice you. Jack had questions, dozens of them, but he could tell she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he focused on finding somewhere safe. He didn't know this part of the city well, but he remembered passing a small boarding house near the transit station earlier that day. It had old walls and cheap locks, but it might buy them a little time. They turned a corner, and the crowd thinned. The sound of footsteps on wet concrete followed. Quieter than before, but impossible to ignore, Jack caught the faint reflection of movement in a puddle ahead of them. He knew they weren't alone. "You need to tell me why they're after you," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with urgency. Lyra hesitated, her hands tightening around the jacket. "They own this district," she whispered. "Everything here belongs to them. The streets, the shops, the people." Her voice broke, and she added, "I was promised to one of them as payment for a debt." Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask what that meant. "I ran before they could take me," she continued. "But they always find people like me." The words hung between them like smoke, heavy and choking. The boarding house came into view. A narrow building leaning slightly to one side, its yellow lights casting a sickly glow over the cracked steps. Jack pushed the door open, and they stepped into a dim hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. An old alien woman behind the counter looked up, her eyes flicking from Jack to Lyra. She didn't ask questions, just handed over a key when Jack paid in cash. The room was small and plain, with a single bed, a metal chair, and a cracked window that looked out over the alley. Lyra sat on the bed, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. She looked so small that for a moment Jack felt a pang of something deeper than just concern. It was the realization that she had probably never known safety in her life. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the street below. A delivery vehicle passed. Then a lone figure paused under the streetlight. It was one of the gang's men, his face hidden by a hood, but the way he stood perfectly still, hands in pockets, told Jack everything. They weren't going to rush in. They were going to wait. Lyra's voice broke the silence. "You should leave me here," she said softly. "If they think you're helping me, they'll hurt you too." Jack didn't turn from the window. "Too late for that," he replied, his tone steady. The night stretched on, the city sounds fading into the distance. But the shadow under the streetlight never moved. Jack knew they were sending a message. "We see you. We're patient, and we'll take her when we want." Hours later, the hum of the building's old heater was broken by a faint sound. Metal against metal, Jack's hand went to the knife on his belt. He moved quietly to the door and listened. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. He glanced back at Lyra and put a finger to his lips. She froze, her wide eyes fixed on the door. The steps stopped right outside. Then a soft knock echoed in the room. Jack didn't answer. The knock came again, louder this time. A voice, smooth and cold, spoke from the other side. "We don't want trouble, human. Just what's ours." Lyra covered her mouth to keep from making a sound. Jack's grip on the knife tightened. "You have until tomorrow night to hand her over." The voice continued. "After that, no one will be able to help you." Silence followed. Then the footsteps retreated. Jack opened the door just a crack. The hallway was empty. But a small object lay on the floor, a coin-like metal token with a jagged mark scratched into it. Lyra saw it and whispered, "That's their claim mark," her voice trembling. Jack put the token in his pocket without a word. He looked at her and knew there was no turning back now. The gang had given him a deadline, and in this city, deadlines were kept in blood. The morning came gray and heavy. The kind of light that made the city's metal towers look like ghosts. Jack hadn't slept. He sat in the chair by the window all night, watching the alley, watching the streetlight where the gang's man had stood for hours. Lyra lay curled on the bed, her breathing soft. But every so often her body twitched like she was fighting something in her dreams. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at him as if making sure he was still there. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything easy to say. Jack knew the clock had started ticking the moment that knock came last night. The gang had given him until nightfall to hand her over. But the quiet between now and then wasn't safety. It was just the slow turn of the knife before it sank in. Lyra sipped the cup of thin, bitter tea he'd brought from the downstairs kitchen, her hands shaking just enough for him to notice. "They'll come before dark," she said finally, her voice a whisper. "They like to make examples where everyone can see." Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we can't stay here," he replied. "But you need to tell me where we can go that they won't follow." She shook her head, a humorless laugh escaping her. There is no place like that in this city. Jack had been in bad situations before, but this was different. There were no friends to call, no safe houses to slip into. The only advantage he had was that the gang didn't yet know what he was willing to do. By midday, the rain had started again, thin and sharp. Lyra stood by the window, watching the street below like she was memorizing every face that passed. Jack noticed her flinch when a black cargo truck rolled by, 3 men in the back scanning the sidewalks. He pulled her away from the glass before they could see her. They needed to move, but moving meant being seen. And being seen meant the gang could act without witnesses. Jack decided they would try the side streets toward the old industrial sector, a place too broken and empty for even the gangs to care about. Maybe there they could buy a few hours to think. They left the boarding house through the back. The old alien woman at the counter, never looking up from her worn-out book. The alley smelled of rust and wet stone, and every sound felt louder than it should have. Lyra walked close to him, her head low. They had made it 2 blocks before the first shadow appeared, a tall figure stepping out from a narrow doorway ahead of them, his eyes glowing faintly under the brim of his hood. Jack slowed, scanning the corners. 2 more stepped out behind them, cutting off the way back. "You've had your night," the one in front said, his voice casual, almost bored. "Time to be smart and hand her over." Jack didn't answer. He shifted his stance just enough to balance his weight. The men noticed and smirked. "Human, you don't survive here by being brave. You survive by knowing when you've lost." Lyra's hand gripped Jack's sleeve, her whisper barely audible. "Please, don't fight them." But Jack's eyes stayed locked on the one speaking, his tone calm. "If you want her, you'll have to take her from me." The smirk faded, replaced by a cold grin. The leader nodded once, and the two behind them moved. Jack grabbed Lyra's arm and shoved her toward a gap between two buildings. "Run," he said sharply. She hesitated, but the look in his eyes made her move. The alley they darted into was narrow and choked with pipes and hanging wires. Footsteps thundered behind them. Jack's boots splashed through ankle-deep water as he kept close on Lyra's heels. Ahead, a rusted chain-link fence blocked the way. Without slowing, Jack grabbed the mesh and hauled himself over, landing hard on the other side. He reached up and pulled her down after him just as the first of the gang's men reached the fence. They ran until their lungs burned, turning corner after corner until the city around them changed. The lights faded. The buildings became hollow shells of metal and concrete. The industrial sector. They stopped inside the shell of an abandoned warehouse. The roof half collapsed, rain dripping in slow, steady taps. Lyra was bent over, catching her breath, her eyes still wide from the chase. "You can't keep doing this for me," she said. "Between breaths, they'll kill you." Jack leaned against the wall, his chest rising and falling. "Not if I kill the problem first." She stared at him like she wasn't sure if he was serious. But deep down, she knew he was. The warehouse smelled of rust and damp oil. Every step they took echoed through the hollow space, like whispers that didn't belong to them. Jack kept his back to the wall, scanning every opening, every shadow. His mind working fast, he knew running wouldn't solve anything. The gang would hunt Lyra until she was either caught or dead, and if he kept her with him without a plan, they'd both end up the same way. Lyra sat on an overturned crate, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked smaller in the gray. Light leaking through the holes in the roof, her voice was quiet but certain. "You can't fight them, Jack." "They own too much," she said. "Even the city guards take orders from them." Jack crouched in front of her, his eyes steady. "You said they own this district, but they're not the law. They're just parasites." He replied, "Parasites. Can be cut out?" She blinked at him, unsure if he was being reckless or just didn't understand how deep the gang's reach went. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the jagged marked token the man had left at their door. He turned it in his hand, letting the dim light catch its edges. "This is their claim mark," he said. "But a mark is just a piece of metal. It means nothing if the people it's meant to scare stop obeying it." Lyra shook her head slowly. "They don't just scare people, Jack. They destroy them, their families, their homes." Her voice trembled as she looked at the ground. "That's what they did to me." He didn't push her to explain more. "Not yet." Instead, he asked, "You said last night you have nowhere to hide, but you also told me you ran from them. You must have had somewhere to go." She hesitated, her lips tightening like she was keeping something inside. Finally, she said, "I was trying to get to the old freight hub. There's something there. Something I hid a long time ago." Jack tilted his head. "What is it?" Her gaze met his for the first time in hours. "Proof," she whispered. "Names, places, trades they've made. Everything." He leaned back, thinking. If she was telling the truth, that kind of evidence could burn the gang's control from the inside out. But it also meant they'd kill anyone who even touched it. "Where in the hub?" he asked. "In a storage crate, near the east tracks." She said, "But it's locked, and the key." "I don't have it anymore." Jack let out a slow breath. "Then we find another way to open it." Her eyes widened. "You're actually going there?" He stood, scanning the broken doorway of the warehouse. "If it's the only way to end this, then yes." They moved out before the sun had fully set. The industrial sector was nearly deserted, but its emptiness was dangerous in its own way. No witnesses, no one to hear if something went wrong. The wind howled through the metal skeletons of old buildings, carrying the scent of burning fuel from far-off factories still in use. They kept to the edges, slipping between collapsed walls and rusting cargo lifts. Twice Jack pulled her into cover when patrol drones buzzed overhead, their red lights sweeping the streets below. The closer they got to the freight hub, the more signs of life they saw, barrels burning in the shadows. Figures hunched close to the heat, eyes tracking them but saying nothing. Finally, the freight hub came into view, a sprawling ruin of old tracks and crumbling storage hangars. The giant sliding doors of the main building hung off their rails, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the darkness was thick, broken only by thin shafts of moonlight. Lyra led him through the maze of crates and broken machinery, her steps quick but careful. "It's here," she whispered, stopping in front of a large cargo container half buried under other crates. The lock was a heavy alien mechanism, thick with corrosion. Jack examined it, running his fingers along the cold metal. "I can break it," he murmured, "but it's going to make noise." Before she could answer, a sound reached them, soft at first, then growing clearer. Boots on metal. Coming from the far side of the hangar, Lyra's eyes went wide. "They found us," she breathed. Jack's hand went to the pistol at his side, the weight of it grounding him. He glanced at her once. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm. The footsteps grew louder, shadows shifting against the thin streams of light. The gang wasn't just hunting anymore. They were closing in. The first figure stepped into the faint light cutting through the roof. His hood pushed back just enough to show the jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. Behind him came two more, each armed with long, lunked blades that caught the moonlight in thin silver flashes. They didn't rush. They spread out slowly, blocking every gap between the crates, the way predators did when they knew their prey had nowhere to go. Jack kept himself between them and Lyra, his pistol steady in his hand. The gang leader's eyes slid past him like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. His attention fixed on her. "You've caused us a lot of walking tonight, girl," he said, his voice rough and low. "Time to stop running." Lyra's breathing quickened, but she didn't move. Jack stepped forward just enough to draw the leader's eyes back to him. "You'll have to take her over my body," he said, the words even, almost quiet, but they landed like a challenge. One of the men laughed under his breath. "That can be arranged." They moved in at once. Fast and fluid, Jack fired once, the shot echoing in the metal hangar like a crack of thunder. One of the men dropped with a shout, clutching his leg. The others kept coming. Jack dodged between two crates, drawing them away from Lyra, his boots thudding against the hollow floor. Lyra crouched by the cargo container, her hands working frantically at the lock, the noise of the fight covering the faint clicks of her attempts. She didn't have the key, but desperation made her movements sharper, faster. Jack blocked a swing from one of the hooked blades, the metal ringing as it struck the wall beside his head. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the man's jaw, sending him staggering back. The leader was on him next, a heavy punch driving into his ribs hard enough to steal his breath. Jack staggered but didn't fall. Lyra's fingers found a weak point in the old lock, her nails scraping against rusted grooves. Then, with a sharp twist, it gave way. The door creaked open just enough for her to slip inside. Jack saw her movement out of the corner of his eye. The leader saw it too, and his expression twisted into something ugly. He lunged for her, but Jack stepped into his path, ramming his shoulder into the man's chest. They hit the ground hard, rolling across the dusty floor. From inside the container, Lyra's voice called, "I've got it," her tone wild with urgency. She clutched a small black case, its surface covered in strange alien markings, the kind that meant value and danger in equal measure. The leader broke free of Jack's grip and reached for her, but Jack grabbed him by the back of his coat and yanked him down again. "Go, Lyra," Jack shouted, his voice carrying through the hangar. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before darting toward the side exit. Two more gang members appeared at the far end of the aisle. Blocking her escape, she stopped short, clutching the case. Tighter, they moved toward her. Their steps measured, the kind of pace that meant they wanted her to know there was no way out. Jack caught sight of them and felt a flash of cold rage. He barreled into the leader, slamming him against a crate hard enough to shake the stack. Then pulled his pistol and fired twice, the shots tearing into the shadows ahead. One man went down, the other stumbled but kept coming. Lyra darted to the side. Slipping into a narrow gap between two containers, she could hear the gang scattering to cut her off, the case heavy in her arms. Her feet pounding against the metal floor. She didn't know where Jack was now. Only that the noise of the fight kept shifting, moving farther from her. Jack reappeared just as she burst into a wider aisle. His face slick with sweat, his shirt torn at the shoulder. "This way," he barked. Grabbing her arm, they sprinted together toward the side exit, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. They crashed through the half-broken door into the cold night air, the freight yard stretching out under the pale glow of the moon. The acid drizzles stinging their skin as they ran for the shadows beyond the tracks, the case still locked in Lyra's arms like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Behind them, the hangar filled with shouts, and the gang's footsteps followed into the night. The freight yard stretched like an endless maze of rusted tracks and skeletal cranes, the air sharp with the metallic taste of acid rain. Jack and Lyra ran low, weaving between stacks of abandoned cargo. The case clutched against her chest like it was part of her body. Every few seconds, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of the gang's glowing eyes staring back through the darkness. Jack slowed only when they reached the shadow of a toppled crane, its massive arm leaning against the side of an old maintenance shed. He motioned for her to stay quiet and pressed himself against the wall. Listening, the rain pattered steadily on the metal above. But beneath it, he could hear faint, deliberate footsteps, not close yet, but coming. "They're spreading out," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Lyra's voice was tight. "They won't stop. Not until I'm back in their hands or dead." Jack looked at the case she held. "Then whatever's in there better be worth it." Her eyes flicked to him, the faint light catching the fear in them. "It's worth more than my life," she said, and he could tell she meant it. He took a deep breath, scanning the yard. "We can't keep running in circles," he said. "If we try to hide forever, they'll find us. We need to hit them first." Her brow furrowed. "You're talking about going after them." "I'm talking about ending this," he replied. "And that starts with making sure they can't chase us tonight." They slipped into the maintenance shed, the air inside thick with the smell of oil and dust. Jack rummaged through the clutter, finding a coil of wire, a cracked radio, and, in the corner, a small crate of old mining charges, the kind used to break apart large rock shipments. Most were useless from age, but a few still hummed faintly with stored energy. Lyra's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." Jack checked one of the charges, twisting the timer knob too. "See if it still moved freely, serious enough to bet my life on it," he said. "We use these to slow them down. Buy us a clear shot to get out of the district." They worked quickly, Jack setting the charges near the larger crates at the edge of the yard, the ones that would block the main path if they collapsed. Lyra kept watch, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. Each minute felt longer than the last. The first sign of the gang came as a flicker of motion near the far end of the tracks. 3 shapes slipping between the stacks with practiced ease, their movements too controlled to be anything but trained hunters. Jack set the final charge and grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her toward the back exit of the shed. They had just reached the open yard again when a sharp whistle cut through the air, the sound bouncing off the metal walls. Lyra froze. "That's their signal," she whispered. Jack didn't slow. "Good. Means they're all coming this way." The shouts started seconds later. Boots hammering against the ground, beams of light cutting through the darkness as they fanned out. Jack led her toward the narrow service tunnel at the edge of the yard, the one place he'd seen earlier that might give them a hidden exit. The rain was heavier now, each drop burning faintly against his skin. Behind them, the first of the gang spotted the charges, but before he could shout a warning, Jack pressed the detonator in his hand. The night split open with a deep, rolling blast. Metal screamed as the cargo stacks toppled, slamming into the tracks and crushing the main route. The shock wave threw dust and rain into the air, drowning the gang's shouts in the roar of destruction. Lyra stumbled from the force, but Jack caught her and pulled her into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them, their footsteps splashing through shallow water. The only light, the faint glow of her eyes in the pitch black. When they finally emerged on the far side, the city stretched out ahead, darker here, quieter, the streets almost empty. Lyra looked back toward the freight yard, the smoke still curling upward into the night. "You didn't just slow them down," she said softly. "You made them angry." Jack met her gaze, his voice low. "Good. Angry men make mistakes." He started walking, the case still locked in her arms. And in the silence between them, the unspoken truth settled in. The fight wasn't over. It was only changing shape, and the next move would decide everything. The streets in this part of the city were darker, stripped of the neon that painted the richer districts. Only the weak glow of broken street lamps lit the way. Jack kept a steady pace, his eyes scanning the shadows. Lyra followed close, clutching the black case so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Every so often she looked behind them, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the low hum of the rain on metal rooftops. It was too quiet. Jack knew silence in a city like this was never safety. It was a breath held before a strike. The freight yard had bought them time. Not enough. The gang would regroup, and when they did, they'd bring more than knives and blades. They'd come with numbers. They reached the edge of a small plaza, its stone surface slick and shining. The few market stalls here were closed, their fabric covers flapping softly in the wind. Lyra stopped in the shadow of a column, her voice low. "We can't keep running from street to street, Jack. Even if we leave the district, they'll find us." Jack glanced at the case in her arms. "Then it's time we make this worth the risk." They ducked into a narrow passage that opened into the basement of an abandoned cafe. The air smelled faintly of mold and old coffee. Jack set a small lamp on the table and motioned for her to open the case. She hesitated, then pressed her palm against the side. Alien glyphs lighting up under her touch. With a faint hiss, the lock disengaged. Inside were stacks of thin, transparent data slates, each one glowing faintly with recorded information. Jack picked one up, scrolling through the symbols until he found a section marked in Universal Trade Script. His eyes narrowed as he read. Names, transaction logs, shipment coordinates, everything she had promised. But more than that, he saw payments to city officials, evidence that the gang's reach went higher than either of them had guessed. "This isn't just enough to hurt them," Jack said, setting the slate down. "This is enough to burn their clee. They saw my place ton of their resewer, but more than that, may see as a law last K. But more than that, he saw payments to resend us, my CHO. They saw Cleese, my seed. It is sleek at my sea. Their seed consibe my seed, it is slash lie. I see it. I is it. My citad. It's secretative. I may say it. I lies it I say to me six it to sign me it say sit it kite I let's sick it did it's it put it to my did it's it to the by sick it lace it it's today to the beak up the today to stick it's at the into the entire empire. Lyra's voice was sharp with warning. Then they'll kill us faster. A sound above them made them both freeze, the creak of a floorboard. Slow and deliberate, Jack put a finger to his lips and moved toward the stairs. His pistol drawn, another creak came, closer this time. He swung around the corner just as a shadow lunged from the darkness. They hit the floor hard, Jack twisting. To keep the blade aimed away from his chest, the attacker snarled. The dim light catching the gang's jagged clay mark burned into his cheek. Before the man could shout, Jack drove his elbow into his jaw, the crack echoing in the small room. The man crumpled, but more footsteps followed, heavy and fast. They found us. Lyra breathed, backing toward the far wall. Jack grabbed the case and shoved it into her arms. Back exit, now, he ordered. She didn't argue. They ran through the rear door into a narrow alley, the walls closing in on both sides. Voices shouted behind them, boots pounding on the stones. Jack fired a single shot at a hanging pipe overhead. Steam burst into the air, filling the passage with a thick, blinding fog. They didn't stop running until the alley opened into a loading bay, an old cargo hauler sitting there like it had been abandoned years ago. Jack yanked the side door open, pushing her inside. He climbed in after her and hit the ignition. The engine coughed, then roared to life as the hauler rolled into the night. The city lights shrinking behind them. Lyra sat in the passenger seat, staring at the case in her lap. Her voice was quiet, but certain. If we deliver this, it's over for them. Jack kept his eyes on the road, the rain streaking across the windshield. Then we don't stop until it's in the right hands. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of streets, the gang was already hunting again, but ahead was the faint promise of freedom, and Jack had no intention of letting go.